going to share with you a Native American proverb. Don't know if you've heard this one before. Listen, or your tongue will make you deaf. Listen, or your tongue will make you deaf. Takes a bit of thinking about, doesn't it? Listen, or your tongue will make you deaf. Because if we're busy talking, if our head is full of stuff, we're not really listening to somebody else then, are we? Or listening to God. One of the lectionary readings today, it's not the main lectionary reading, but one of the readings for today acknowledges the fact that today is a special day. Does anybody know what today is? Thursday. Thursday, the 11th of July, 2019. St. Benedict. Today is the feast day of St. Benedict. It's not the day of his death, as far as I'm aware, or the day that he was born, but it is the day that he is remembered across the churches, particularly across the churches in Europe. And he lived about 1,500 years ago, and yet we still talk about this man. His main achievement, he wrote the Rule of St. Benedict, which immediately sounds as though it is a legalistic way of life. Doesn't sound terribly attractive, does it? The Rule of St. Benedict, black and white, coming under the thumb, very authoritarian. That's what it sounds like. But actually it isn't. Because the word that is translated rule actually comes from a word that really means scaffold or trellis or framework. Something to hang something on. And the Rule of Benedict was written to help particularly the early monks to have a way of life that enabled them to focus on God and to live in community. It was a framework for life, if you like. And that framework is still as much active today as it was then. Still seen as a wise and godly way of life for those that want to live in that Godward-looking way, whether you're in a monastic community or not. And because of that, actually, he's credited with really being the founding father of Western monastic tradition because of his rule, his framework for life. And so one of the lectionary readings is 1 Corinthians 3, verses 10 and 11. By the grace God has given me, I laid a foundation as an expert builder, and someone else is building on it. But each one should be careful how he builds, for no one can lay any foundation other than the one already laid, which is Jesus Christ. And Benedict did that. He laid a foundation which has continued to be built upon, but the foundation he laid was very firmly on Jesus Christ, Lord and Saviour. So it seemed appropriate this morning to look at one of his sayings and to see how that applies to us today. There's lots of sayings that we could have looked at, but one I particularly like is right at the beginning of his prologue, almost his opening sentences. Listen carefully, incline the ear of your heart. Listen carefully, incline the ear of your heart. Now, if you've studied anatomy, I guess you're thinking, but the heart hasn't got any ears. So we need to unpack it a bit. There's so much said about listening these days, isn't there? That, there's more and more taught about how we should listen, and yet I wonder if actually the skills of listening are less and less well done. Have you ever said to someone, "Are you listening?" And they say yes, and you say, "What did I say?" And they say, not sure. Or they might say, "I didn't know that was happening today," and you say, "I told you," but you weren't listening. And there's more and more and more to listen to these days, isn't there? We can fill our heads with, be plugged into our little individual worlds, and we can listen to music and downloaded stuff and the radio and podcasts and who knows what else. Nothing wrong with that. Absolutely nothing wrong with that. But it does fill our head and our days with noise, doesn't it? I wonder how much we actually hear, how much we filter out. Even our communication these days, I think, if you look around, is less and less by I talk, you listen, or you talk, I listen. So much more of it is on social media, isn't it? And we've even filtered out some of the words, and we use little pictures instead, don't we, with the smiley face or the not so smiley face, or the smiley face with the tears. And sometimes I find it quite a puzzlement to work out what the expression is actually saying. But there we go, that might just be me. But that kind of communication doesn't require us to hear tone of voice, to hear the thing that's being not said underneath, the unspoken, to read the facial expression, to see the tears or the smile that is there, but actually there's a mask as well. And our communication seems to be less and less about that, and more about what we can do on our phones. And we can zone out when we listen. Have you ever done that? There's a story I like of a child talking to her daddy. And he is busy working on the computer, as you do. And the child is chattering on. And he's trying to work. And he's going, good? Okay. Yeah. Good. And they mimic the good communication skills, don't they? That kind of non-response. If you've done any communication skills training, you'll know that it's important to give affirmation to the one that you're listening to let them know that you're listening without interrupting the flow. And we've taken those things so that we can use them without listening, actually, but just give the impression that we are. Isn't it sad? Isn't it sad? So this little girl who was trying to get her daddy to listen to what she was saying said, "Dad." Carried on. "Dad." Carried on. "Dad." "What?" he said. "I'm listening." She said, "But your face isn't." Your face isn't. It's very telling, isn't it? And there's a psychologist who, when she sees clients, gives them homework first time she sees them. Homework, maybe, or maybe a prescription. And I don't know if you've ever seen a psychologist or somebody in that line of work who does this, but tells you before the next meeting to spend 30 minutes in undistracted silence every day. Now, why would she do that? I wonder. And I wonder how much of a challenge that would be for all of us, to spend 30 minutes a day in undistracted silence. The reason being, of course, that when we sit in silence, the things that we have kept at bay, those things that we don't really want to think about, those things that trouble us, we can keep at bay by being busy, by talking, by listening, by filling our head with music or watching the television or whatever it is. The very things that we don't want to be bubbling up to the surface, we keep out there until we are silent. And then they all come rushing in. And that's, of course, what she wanted. She wanted the person to be acknowledging what was coming up to the surface and be bringing it to the next session. That was her intention. It's an opportunity to listen to ourselves, as well as learning how to listen to the therapist. And here we have Benedict in the opening of his prologue saying, listen with the ear of your heart. So what does that really mean then, to listen with the ear of our hearts? Well, I think it's about finding a place of feeling and meaning, connecting, physically sometimes, emotionally, spiritually, with what the person is saying. It's the engagement of the whole of our being in listening to someone else. And then it becomes a gift of time, the time that is spent, but it's also the gift of yourself. And sometimes that's all people need to do, isn't it? Is to talk. There's healing in that. There's a story of a counsellor who said that many of her clients actually did not need counselling. They needed someone that they could sit with for an hour a week and just talk to someone who really listened. That's a sad indictment on our society, isn't it? That you have to pay someone to do that with. But I think when Benedict wrote his rule, it wasn't just about how we listen to one another. It might have something to say about how we listen to God. Think of all I've said so far about zoning out and being distracted and head being full of stuff and all of that. What happens when you sit down to be still to pray? Your head's full of stuff, isn't it? What I need to do next week, what I need to do this afternoon, what shopping I need to do. I must remember to do that. I've got to return that call. I must remember to answer that email. And the list goes on. And you end up thinking, oh, this is hopeless. Sorry, Lord, and on you go. I better just get on with it because I'm never going to be still enough to be with you today. Mother Teresa said, God speaks in the silence of the heart. Listening is the beginning of prayer. Listening is the beginning of prayer. That listening, whole person engagement, body, mind, spirit engagement is how we need to listen to God. And if we could do that, if we could learn that whole engagement, listen with the ear of our hearts, how much more aware of him and his presence we would be. How much more aware. And in case you think I've got this sorted, no, I haven't. But you know, sitting in stillness and having that kind of awareness with God is life transforming, especially when you haven't got the words to put into prayer what you want to express. If it's something that you haven't tried, don't aim for 30 minutes in your first go. Maybe 5 at the most. And it might take you several goes, weeks even, to achieve even 5 minutes of utter stillness. It's a bit like climbing Ben Nevis, if you've ever done that. It's an uphill journey. And you might find it useful to have a little book alongside you, so that when that thought rushes in that you've suddenly remembered you had an email 3 weeks ago that you haven't answered, write it down so that you haven't got to then sit there and think, I must remember that email, I must remember that email. Write it down, let it go, and go back to being still. It's a struggle for ages, but the view is worth it when you get there. So on the day that we celebrate Benedict, listen with the ear of the heart to each other and to the Lord. There is healing in his presence.